Right, it's time for another sort of technical discussion video really. I've had a video request for this specific subject from a YouTuber called RD1979. He PM'd me not long ago asking me if I could do a sort of explanation awareness video on Scart RGB input and actually what it's all about. For people that are in Europe, this isn't anything new, and a lot of people in Europe will know what a Scart input or a Scart connector is, perhaps what types of video signals that it can transfer over that connection method, but there is still some ignorance there. Certainly in the retro gaming scene, there's a lot more sort of knowledge and awareness of that input, but certainly on the other side of the pond in America, I suspect there's a fair bit of ignorance about actually what that input is, because it isn't, or it wasn't something and isn't something that is a standard or was a standard over in the US. I don't know why that was never the case, but anyway, I'll just give a sort of run through really what Scart is, what it enabled, or what it can enable you to do, and I'm just going to centre this around retro console gaming because that's where it's as relevant now as it was back in the day for that kind of source of video signal. Scart. Now I've got Scart leads coming up my backside. I'm not gonna, in fact I haven't got one handy actually at the moment. I suspect you all know what a Scart socket or a Scart plug looks like. If you don't, just have a look on Google and you'll see millions of references to that type of input or output. I'm not actually sure when it came into effect, certainly in Europe. It was around, RGB Scart was certainly around in the 90s. Not sure if it came into effect sometime in sort of in the 80s, but it's been quite a common connection type in Europe for a number of years now, sort of well over 20 years. It started to come online in Europe around 20 years ago, certainly as regards to RGB Scart, and this is where it can get slightly confusing. Scart itself is the type of plug or connector, so it can contain up to 21 pins, and each one of those pins can do something, obviously, but not all of them are connected. They certainly don't have to be connected. In Europe it's actually called the Euro connector, Scart Euro connector, and I'm sure someone will correct me on this, but I certainly know that the actual physical connection plug is actually used in Japan as well, but the wiring configuration between a European Scart connector and a Japanese Scart connector is actually different. The pins are used for different things, even though it's actually the same plug. So you can actually plug in a European Scart connector into a Japanese Scart socket, it won't actually work, and you can actually damage your equipment, or potentially damage your equipment. Now, I'm not sure who else or what other regions have used Scart. I know that it certainly hasn't been readily available in the US, but the interesting thing about Scart is that it can carry various signals. It's not just about RGB. It can carry video composite as well. The good thing about the Scart socket or Scart, the Scart standard, is that it can carry audio, or it carries audio in the same plug as well as the video signal. So it's quite an all-encompassing sort of standard adoption for video and audio signals. Now, if I give you a very, very brief explanation of the common analog type connections, and I'm sure you've all heard of these, but I'll actually do them in order of preference to quality, starting with the very lowest and working my way up to the best. Now, this is all to do with analog connections. It's got nothing to do with digital, so it's not your DVI stuff, it's not your SDR, sorry, not SDR, it's not your DVI stuff, it's not HDMI stuff. So this is all analog connections. It's not a digital connection, it's analog, which obviously is, or was, what was around sort of in the retro days. We hadn't moved to digital at that point. So if I start off at the crappiest and work my way up to the better, and I'll tell you the differences between them, or the best way that I can in a short description without getting too technical. Okay, if we start off with RF, console like the Nintendo Entertainment System had an RF output on it. So that's combining audio and video into a single coax lead, and that would actually then pass through the TV tuner of your TV to get a picture. Now, because it's passing through all that crap, all that tuning equipment, and the signal was absolutely awful, absolutely dog shit in my eyes. But you know, when you're young and you're in the retro scene, well, not the retro scene then, that was a current gen scene then, it didn't matter. But RF is the lowest of the low. Next one up would be composite video. That again is a single cable connection, and it's actually a single bit of wire in effect, and that carries just video. All that does is carry just video. So it's certainly cleaner. It's a certainly cleaner image than RF, because they've actually managed now to actually split the audio and video out. So you have a composite video lead just for the video, and then you would have audio normally covered through a left and right or a mini jack output. So when you start to split out the audio and the video, you'll start to get a better video quality, because you're not throwing as much down this one bit of string in effect. Composite video is, or was, and still is now to a degree, on nearly all devices. It's quite a common connection method as regards to availability. It is starting to be weaned out now, certainly with digital stuff coming in, there's just no need for it, but because it's such a common connection method, it's probably I'd probably suggest it's the most common standard of video connection that is available on nearly all devices. If you get something like a digital camera that you can output to a TV, most of those will go into a composite video output. So it's probably the most common connection method, but again, it's crap. In my eyes, it's crap. Don't use it. The next one up is Super VHS or Super Video. That still insisted on having video as a separate output, but now they actually start to split the video signal out even within the same lead. So you had I think it was it's luminance and luminance and contrast. So brightness and contrast. I think it's split out brightness and contrast. Without looking on Google, I can't. I'm probably giving you some duff information here, but it's definitely split out now. The video signal down a single cable probably got more than one wire in there, it was actually splitting the video signal out into two distinct parts of that signal. So again, because they're doing that, they can actually enhance the clarity even more. So you got super video, and again, that was a fairly common input and output, certainly in the old days. It certainly wasn't as common as composite, but every step and every different change in connection method, they were looking to clean the signal up even more and more and more and more. So you've got super video. The next two are probably what you would call the pinnacle of an analog signal. One of them is the one that's common in Europe and Japan, and that's Scart RGB. Now I will say specifically Scart RGB because just using a Scart socket, because a Scart socket can actually carry a normal composite video signal, and some of the devices back in the day weren't actually Scart RGB enabled. They were Scart enabled. I'm talking about European devices here. They were Scart enabled, but not all of them were Scart RGB enabled. Now I remember back in the day when I got my first Super Nintendo, 21 years ago, and it was a Scart RGB modified Super Nintendo, and that's when I really got into the sort of RGB side of things and realised that basically from then on it had to be an RGB feed. You couldn't go back to anything else because it was just crap in comparison. And yet you actually had to hunt around for a TV at that time that would actually accept a Scart RGB signal. So even though the plug on the back was a Scart socket, you wouldn't the TV necessarily wouldn't be wired up internally to be able to accept an RGB signal. And at the time the limitation was basically it was down to Sony TVs. They were the ones on the market that were Scart RGB compatible at the time, but of course over the years a lot of the manufacturers adapted their TV design so they could actually accept an RGB signal. So the next connection method up on analog is Scart RGB. Excuse me. Now, assuming that it's Scart RGB enabled as an output from a device, and also your input device, your viewing device, is also Scart RGB compatible. And the main difference, or the biggest difference, is that a CRT tube has a red, green and blue gun on the back of the tube. So it uses those three colours to combine them in various ways, levels and powers and so forth, to actually mix the colours on the screen, to get the colours that you see on the screen. So using the primary colours. A Scart RGB lead will take those RGB colours, the same colours, separately, and it will transfer them from the source device to the output device, and the output device, if it's compatible with Scart RGB, will directly take those RGB signals in and basically pass them straight to the gun on the back of the CRT. So you cut out a lot of the crap inside the TV as regards to the tuner and they didn't really have video processors then in that day, but any of the extra crap that the signal doesn't have to go through, it doesn't go through that, it goes straight to the gun in effect. So you get a real clear picture, because basically natively the TV would always have to go through the RGB cycle in the back of its tube. So whatever signal you feed it, it will have to use that method to actually display the picture. So using a Scart RGB connection, the throughput means it will go straight to its native sort of process or method that it needs to use to actually produce the picture. And because you've got each colour channel is separated, you get the best possible picture you can get. on an analogue device. Now, there's other things in the SCART socket as well. It's also required like a sync signal, but that's all part and parcel anyway of the appropriate wiring for that socket. But for all intent and purpose, the reason why you get such a sharp signal on an RGB feed is because you're splitting out the video to your red, green and blue, and the TV device will actually take that in and feed it straight to its tube and display it on the screen on its, on its CRT that you see. So that's a very, very brief and simplistic sort of description of the quality levels of the various leads. Now, something else that certainly the US had, and actually Europe didn't have that much of, is component. Component is very similar to an RGB feed, a SCART RGB feed, sorry, because it splits out the colours. So again, on phono jacks on US devices, you will get red, green and blue. Each one of those, I think, carries a sync signal as well with it. I think, I'm not entirely sure, or one of them does, or one of them can. But that was, for all intent and purpose, excuse me, that was the US's version of the SCART RGB quality signal. They are the same quality, or they should be the same quality, because you're splitting out the three primary colours. If you have a device that's via component, or a device via RGB SCART, the picture quality should be exactly the same. There shouldn't be any difference. So those two types of input-output are at the top of the food chain, really, for analog video feeds. Now, of course, component isn't, or wasn't, that common, certainly for the gaming scene. So you can't get that many consoles that will actually give a component output, because the actual source is totally different. The video source is totally different. You can't, for instance, get a SCART lead and somehow put an adapter on it and get 3 phonos coming out of it. It doesn't work like that, because it is a different type of signal. What you have to do, you have to buy a device. You could get a device that transcodes from RGB SCART to component, but you've got to buy a transcoder. You can't literally just rewire the plug and it'll just work. And because of that, there's certainly problems in the US with getting older consoles, for instance Super Nintendo or a Mega Drive, working at its best video sort of standard output, because you can't you can convert, but you can't easily convert between RGB SCART, which is what those consoles can output natively with the appropriate lead, into component. So in some ways the Americans have had a bit of a short straw, really, for that, and I can understand why a lot of Americans will stick with super video, or dare I say composite video, as a means to get a signal on the screen. But I haven't used composite video or even super video for over 20 years now, simply because it has to be, if it's analog, it has to be RGB SCART. If it's not RGB SCART, I won't use it. I won't use it, and that might sound a bit sort of crazy, but the difference between the various video types, it's just like chalk and cheese to me. It really is. It's I just wouldn't use super video or composite. They just look absolute crap, they really do. Compared to an RGB feed, whether that's component or SCART RGB, the difference is just, it's amazing. It's an amazing difference between the two. Now, the final analog output that I actually forgot to mention, I've just been replaying the video back as part of the editing, and I thought, I forgot about this connection method. It's still analog. It's at the top of the food chain. In reality, it's higher than component and Scart RGB in some way, and I'll explain a bit about that in a minute. But you've got VGA output, and I'll stick with VGA because there is CGA, VGA and Super VGA and all sorts of different sort of GA outputs, but basically what you would interpret from a PC, so a PC output. Now some people think because it's associated with a computer that the D-sub-15 connection method, which is commonly known as VGA or Super VGA, a 15 pin connector. You can get 9 pins as well, but that's for a CGA output, but again that's for something entirely different as regards to resolution, so I'm not going to go through that. We'll just confuse everyone even more. But if we just stick with VGA, because that's what a lot of people commonly know and what the plug looks like, or socket and everything looks like. Yeah, because it's from a PC commonly, people tend to think that's digital. Well, it's not. It's actually analog. It's actually an analog output and input. Now that also carries an RGB signal, and it splits out various other things to do with the sync side of the signal as well. So you actually get a horizontal and vertical sync. You can get a composite sync, but again this is all going down to another technical side that I'm not going to go through in this video. But as a pure connection method, it's still analog. It's perhaps classed as at the top of the food chain really for analog stuff, and I just thought it was worth mentioning that, even though there's hardly any consoles that will output VGA. The only common one that I can think of is the Dreamcast. That'll output a VGA signal via a VGA lead. It's still analog, but anyone that's used a Dreamcast via that connection method to something like a PC monitor, whether it's LCD, plasma, or an old CRT type PC monitor, will appreciate and know that the picture clarity is absolutely pin sharp. But the sort of the common thing between that and a component setup and also a Scart RGB setup is the fact that the VGA is actually splitting out that colour signal to R, G and B. So again, it's why you get the absolute clarity there. So I just thought it was just worth mentioning really about the VGA side of things, that it is still an analog input and output, and it gives you that absolute clarity that you associate with the other connection types that I've just mentioned. That's a very brief run through of those various standards. I'm not sure what else to say really. I think for the, obviously us guys in Europe, we've been spoiled, and we really have. But there's still people that I know that even into the gaming stuff, and they'll use composite, even in Europe when they've still got the availability of RGB Scart, and they'll use composite, and you just think, what the hell are you doing? Because that's just it just looks crap. It just looks absolutely crap. It really does. You lose contrast, you lose brightness, you lose definition, sharpness. I mean, everything about the picture is crap on anything other than RGB. Super VHS isn't that bad. It's not as good as RGB, but it's a lot better than composite video. Certainly a lot better than composite video. You've got better control over the signal. Brightness and contrast is a lot better. Colours are a lot better as well. Yeah, you still get a bleeding effect with the colours. So when you look on the screen, it's a bit washy at the sides. Not as bad as or blurry, I should say. Not as bad as composite, certainly. Yeah, it's still very much different. There are big differences. And nearly all the consoles that you can buy, or you could have bought, or that you can buy nowadays are RGB compatible, output via Scart. So there's really no excuse not to go out and buy an appropriate RGB Scart lead, assuming that you've got a device as regards to a screen that will accept that type of input. I think most LCD and most plasma sets nowadays have RGB Scart inputs in them anyway, but that's another kettle of fish. That's another kettle of fish, and something I wouldn't recommend to do because of the issues you get with processing inside the actual LCD and plasma units, and the signals don't actually come through on the screen that well, to be honest. It does look a bit crap. So in those cases you really do need to use an appropriate line doubler or scaler to get a much better image, but that's another issue altogether. So hopefully that gave you guys some more information about the various standards. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that this is just teaching a granny how to suck eggs. You already know this, but I know that there is a fair bit of ignorance out there, so I just thought I'd go through the various standards for you guys. So get out there, get an RGB Scart set up, and you're going to be rocking. Speak to you again soon. Thanks.